Thank you, Daniel Pelt, the chairman of Technion UK, Jack and Charlotte Churchill, Professor Peretz Lavie, president of the Technion, Professor Alan Dershowitz, lords, ladies and gentlemen. This evening is an extraordinary pleasure for Zahava and myself to be at. We go to quite a lot of evening events. Most of them are full of politicians, where in these days you're asking how many polling points are reflected in the room. Often it's groups of lawyers, and then I find myself asking how many chargeable hours are collected in the room. But on an evening for Technion, you have to ask yourself how many IQ points, or at least Nobel Prizes, are collected in the room, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. You know, really most of the events that I go to are events that are focusing on the problem. And this evening is an evening which is devoted to focusing on the solution. And it's really a pleasure to be here. When I say the problem, we really have extraordinary challenges at the moment. You know you have challenges in Israel. You know it's a complicated situation when you go there, and even the taxi drivers are not telling you what the answer is. And so we truly are at a very difficult situation. You know, anybody that was following, and I know in this room I don't need to speak about it, anybody that was following what went on this past summer, 51 days, 75% of Israelis having to live their lives close to bomb shelters. Anyone that's been following, as you all have, the terrible attacks in Jerusalem since that summer. Anyone that looks at what is going on our borders, where on 4 out of 5 of our borders we find ourselves actually not with a functioning state, but with a terrorist organization or a militant group. These are extraordinary challenges. And obviously we have to respond to them, and in its own way, Technion is part of that response. The fact is, this past summer, the most single significant game changer for Israel's security was the Iron Dome technology, which shoots missiles out of the air with a missile that was developed based on technology that was researched and developed in the Technion. And not just the ideas, the personnel. This past summer, 600 Technion students were called up to actually serve in the defense of the State of Israel. So that's a response to some of our challenges. But we have challenges not only in our region in the Middle East, but here in the UK. As anybody that reads the papers know, that anybody that samples the public atmosphere knows that sadly there is an atmosphere of public delegitimization of Israel. An attempt to turn Israel into the Jew amongst the states. And I cannot help, although we'll be speaking about him later, but pay my personal tribute to Professor Alan Dershowitz, who proves what a single voice, if it is forceful enough, it is passionate enough, if it is thoughtful enough, it is inspiring enough, can do not just to make the case for Israel, but to empower so many other people to raise their heads and their voices as well. Thank you very much indeed. But I think when I say today is about the solution, I mean something that's perhaps deeper than that. Because we have to respond to the threats that we are facing, but there's a more profound response. If we think about what is going on in the Middle East today, you can look at the upheaval that is going on in the countries around us, and you probably have to go back 100 or maybe even 1,000 years to find a similar period of upheaval. And when you try and analyze it, it's obviously different from country to country. But I think one way of understanding it, you try and break it down. Is it generational conflicts? Is it ideological, ethnic, theological conflicts? But I think in one way, these are conflicts between people who are trying to take their countries, their peoples into a better future, and people who are trying to pull them back into some primitive past. And I think the spirit of the Technion and the spirit that has guided it for 102 years is that spirit of the future. And it's not just the countries around us. I've spent more than 20 years in the negotiating room for Israel. And if I had to summarize what my personal takeaway is from those years in the negotiating room, it would be this. Any classic textbook on negotiation theory will tell you that any large-scale negotiation is really 3 negotiations in one. There is first and foremost a negotiation between us and them. It's called the negotiation across the table. But if it's a large-scale negotiation, you have on your side of the table different interests. The Ministry of Defense that want to know what it's going to do to our security. The Ministry of Finance that wants to know what it's going to cost. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And there's a tug of war. And that's called the negotiation along the table. And then finally, at a certain stage in the negotiations, you actually have to sell the deal to the people that sent you. And that's called the negotiation behind the table. So those are the three classic dynamics: across the table, along the table, and behind the table. But I think my personal takeaway from many years in the negotiating room is that there is one more dynamic that takes place, a fourth dynamic. And that's a dynamic that takes place within each negotiator. And that's a negotiation between the past and the future. If you like, a negotiation between the voices of the grandparents and the voices of the grandchildren. And the challenge for the negotiators is to amplify the voices of the grandchildren, to try and make the future as compelling as the voices that are trying to bring us back into the past. And I think the Technion is truly giving voice, amplifying the voices of the grandchildren. And the bridges that it builds as we see between the Technion and Churchill College in Cambridge, and we're so pleased that that program is now going to be spreading to other campuses here in the UK. Those bridges between the Technion and Imperial Colleges, what we know the amazing work with Cornell, those are bridges that are built on a passionate commitment to the future. And of course, it is so appropriate that this evening the honor that is given to Professor Dershowitz is in the name of Winston Churchill, because he himself, not only did he embody that himself, but he expressed that aspiration, and if you like, that challenge to Israel when he visited Israel in 1929, not so long after the Technion itself was founded. What did he say about Israel? He said, "I believe a Jewish national home will be a blessing to the world, to the Jewish race scattered all over the world, and a blessing to Great Britain. Today, I think we are beginning to see that miraculous dream come true, and the Technion is a critical part of it." Thank you very much indeed.